On the cold, bleak plains of rural Wisconsin, in a small quiet town called Plainfield, the horrors that would eventually become the inspiration for some of the most iconic fictional killers, like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, were quietly taking shape. Ed Gein, an unassuming, soft-spoken man, lived an isolated life that masked the gruesome reality of his hidden world. When the truth about Ed Gein finally emerged, the unimaginable nature of his crimes shocked not only the small town of Plainfield, but the entire nation. His grotesque obsessions with death, the human body, and his twisted attachment to his mother painted a macabre picture that seemed ripped straight from the pages of a horror novel. This is the chilling true story of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, whose dark deeds blurred the line between life and death in ways that remain haunting to this day. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, into a household dominated by his deeply religious, domineering mother, Augusta. Augusta, a fervent Lutheran, preached fire and brimstone lessons to her two sons, Ed and his older brother Henry. She believed that all women, except herself, were instruments of sin, and that the world was a wicked place filled with immorality. Augusta forbade her sons from making friends, insisting that the outside world was a corrupting influence. She isolated them on their rural farm, where they grew up under her iron grip. Their father, George Gein, was an alcoholic who worked sporadically as a tanner and carpenter, but his presence was largely overshadowed by Augusta's control. Ed Gein's relationship with his mother was deeply complex and unhealthy. He idolized her, despite her emotionally abusive tendencies. Augusta instilled in him a profound fear of sex and women, condemning both as evil. This laid the foundation for the strange, horrifying acts he would commit later in life. Augusta's teachings shaped Ed's worldview, and he grew into a shy, socially awkward boy who struggled to connect with others. He spent most of his time doing chores around the farm and reading pulp horror magazines, which only fueled his already twisted imagination. In 1940, Ed's father died of heart failure due to his alcoholism, leaving Ed and Henry to fend for themselves on the family farm. Over the next few years, Henry grew increasingly disturbed by Ed's dependence on their mother. He began to question Augusta's influence over them and even openly criticized her, which Ed did not take well. Ed remained fiercely loyal to Augusta, considering her his only true connection to the world. In 1944, tragedy struck the Gein family when Henry was found dead under mysterious circumstances during a fire on the family farm. While the cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation, there were suspicious bruises on Henry's head. Though investigators noted the oddities surrounding his death, no charges were ever filed, and Ed remained the sole caretaker of his beloved mother. Just a year later, Augusta suffered a stroke, leaving her debilitated and dependent on Ed's care. Her health rapidly declined, and in 1945 she passed away, leaving Ed completely alone. Her death shattered him. The one person who had defined his entire existence was gone, and he was left with nothing but the empty, decaying farmhouse and the haunting echoes of her voice. Unable to cope with the loss, Ed sealed off rooms in the house that his mother had used, preserving them as a shrine to her memory. He retreated further into his own mind, slipping deeper into the abyss of madness. After his mother's death, Ed Gein's already fragile mental state began to unravel at an alarming pace. He lived in near complete isolation, rarely interacting with the townspeople of Plainfield. When he did venture into town, he was regarded as an oddball, but no one suspected the horrors lurking beneath his quiet exterior. Unbeknownst to anyone, Ed had developed a morbid fascination with death and the human body. His intense obsession with his mother, coupled with his interest in anatomy and death, drove him to commit his first ghastly acts of grave robbing. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Ed began visiting local cemeteries under the cover of night. Armed with a shovel, he would dig up freshly buried bodies, particularly those of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. He would carefully exhume the corpses and transport them back to his farm, where he would engage in a variety of grotesque activities with the remains. Over the course of several years, Ed exhumed numerous bodies, but his activities went undetected, as he was careful to fill in the graves after each of his macabre excursions. Once back at his farmhouse, Ed would meticulously dissect the corpses, removing the skin and bones. He used the skin to create macabre items such as lampshades, belts, and even a woman's suit that he would wear in an attempt to transform himself into his mother. This chilling practice, known as transvestism, involved Ed wearing the skins of the women he dug up to feel closer to his deceased mother. He even admitted to fashioning masks from the faces of the dead, a practice that would later inspire fictional killers like Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Despite the grotesque nature of his actions, Ed Gein remained largely unnoticed by the townspeople. He was seen as eccentric but harmless, a loner who kept to himself. His disturbing activities inside the farmhouse were hidden from view, and no one suspected that the shy, reclusive man who occasionally worked odd jobs for neighbors was capable of such depravity. As Ed's delusions grew stronger, his desire for fresh bodies intensified. No longer satisfied with grave robbing, he began to contemplate murder. His first known victim was Mary Hogan, a tavern owner in Plainfield who went missing on December 8, 1954. Mary was a brash, tough woman, very different from Ed's quiet and submissive mother, yet something about her intrigued him. One day, Ed entered Mary's tavern, shot her in the head with a .32 caliber revolver, and dragged her body back to his farmhouse. There, he dismembered her and used parts of her body in his grotesque creations. Despite Mary's disappearance, no one suspected Ed. Her tavern was located in a remote area, and it was assumed that she had either left town or met some unfortunate fate while traveling. Ed even joked with local townspeople about her whereabouts, once saying, "Mary Hogan isn't missing. She's at my house." The dark humor was brushed off as the ramblings of an eccentric man, and Ed remained free to continue his grisly activities. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Plainfield hardware store owner Bernice Warden went missing. The last person seen with her was Ed Gein, who had come into the store the day before to inquire about antifreeze. That same day, Bernice's son, Frank, who was a deputy sheriff, discovered that the cash register was open and there was a trail of blood leading out the door. Alarmed, he remembered that Ed had been in the store, and when police searched Ed's farmhouse later that evening, they uncovered a scene that would shock even the most seasoned investigators. When investigators arrived at Ed Gein's farmhouse, they were unprepared for the nightmarish scene that awaited them. As they entered the decaying, cluttered house, they were immediately overwhelmed by the stench of rotting flesh. The rooms were filled with an assortment of bizarre, grisly objects, human remains that had been turned into household items. Chairs upholstered with human skin, a lampshade made from a human face, and a belt made of nipples were just some of the macabre items scattered throughout the house. But the most horrifying discovery was Bernice Warden's body. She had been decapitated, and her body was hanging upside down from the ceiling, gutted like a deer. Her heart was found in a plastic bag, and her head had been severed and was located in a sack. The sheer brutality of her murder and the grotesque nature of the scene left investigators traumatized. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered. As the investigation continued, police found additional body parts from at least 15 different women. Some were confirmed to be from graves Ed had robbed, but others remained unidentified. Ed eventually confessed to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, as well as to his grave-robbing activities, though he claimed that many of the body parts in his home had come from the cemeteries, not fresh victims. Ed Gein was arrested and immediately underwent a psychological evaluation, where it became clear that he was deeply disturbed. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and deemed unfit to stand trial. He was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he remained for nearly a decade. In 1968, after further evaluation, Gein was found competent to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. He was convicted of her murder, but due to his mental illness, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in a mental institution rather than a conventional prison. Ed Gein spent the rest of his life in the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. By all accounts, he was a model patient, showing no signs of the violent behavior that had defined his past. He remained quiet, cooperative, and largely kept to himself during his years at the institution. His infamous crimes, however, cast a long shadow over American culture and cemented his place as one of the most notorious figures in true crime history. Though Ed Gein only officially confessed to 2 murders, the grotesque nature of his crimes left an indelible mark on the public psyche. The twisted, gory details of his body-snatching, grave-robbing, and the macabre artifacts he created from human remains shocked and fascinated the world. His gruesome acts went beyond the typical serial killer narrative. Ed Gein was not just a murderer, he was a human butcher, a man obsessed with death and the transformation of the human body. The discovery of his farmhouse of horrors sent ripples through popular culture. Gein's story became the direct inspiration for several iconic horror characters, each of whom drew from his real-life perversions and psychopathy. The first, and perhaps most well-known character inspired by Gein, was Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, 1960, which was based on Robert Bloch's novel of the same name. Like Gein, Bates had an unhealthy fixation on his domineering mother, preserving her body and becoming her in an effort to keep her alive. Bates's split personality and his macabre relationship with his deceased mother were eerily similar to Gein's own life, making him one of the most chilling fictional killers in cinema history. Gein's influence also loomed large over the creation of Leatherface in Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Leatherface, who wore masks made of human skin and lived in a house filled with grotesque trophies made from human remains, was a direct reflection of Gein's horrific acts. The farmhouse in the film, strewn with body parts and skulls, echoed the nightmarish discovery that police made when they entered Gein's home in 1957. Another notorious character based on Gein was Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Like Gein, Buffalo Bill was obsessed with transforming himself by creating a woman's suit made from the skins of his female victims. The chilling imagery of Bill wearing the skins of his victims drew directly from Gein's real-life transgressions and his attempts to become his mother by donning the skin of women. Through these characters, Gein's horrific legacy lived on, embedding itself in the fabric of American horror and true crime. He became the archetype of the disturbed rural killer, isolated, unassuming, and capable of unimaginable brutality. His crimes highlighted the darkness that could lurk behind the most unassuming of faces and in the most ordinary of places. Understanding what drove Ed Gein to commit his heinous acts has been a subject of speculation for decades. Many experts believe that his relationship with his mother, Augusta, was the key to unlocking his psychopathy. Augusta's intense religious views, coupled with her emotional abuse and psychological control over Ed, left him deeply scarred. Her condemnation of all women as evil likely warped Ed's perception of women, leading him to develop a twisted, confused understanding of love, death, and identity. The isolation in which Ed was raised also played a significant role. Secluded from society, Ed had no opportunity to form healthy relationships or develop normal social skills. His only real connection was to his mother, and when she died, that fragile tether to reality snapped. Unable to cope with her death, he became obsessed with recreating her and filling the void she left behind. His grave robbing and body snatching were, in his mind, attempts to bring her back or become her in some distorted fashion. Furthermore, Gaines' fascination with anatomy and death seemed to feed his growing psychosis. He claimed that he never had sexual intercourse with any of the bodies he exhumed, as they smelled too bad. Instead, his mutilation of corpses and crafting of body parts into grotesque objects appeared to stem from a morbid curiosity about death and a desperate desire to control and understand it. By turning human bodies into objects, lampshades, belts, masks, Gein seemed to diminish the humanity of his victims, reducing them to mere parts in his dark fantasy world. For the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein's crimes left a permanent scar. The quiet, rural community was thrust into the national spotlight, becoming synonymous with horror and death. Plainfield had always been a sleepy, forgotten town, but after the discovery of Gein's crimes, it became a symbol of small-town terror, the place where a monster lived in plain sight. Tourists and curiosity seekers descended on Plainfield, eager to see the house where such unimaginable horrors had taken place. The Gein farmhouse, which had become a spectacle for gawkers, mysteriously burned down in 1958, just a year after his arrest. Whether the fire was accidental or the work of arsonists determined to destroy the place remains unclear. The site of the house is now an empty field, but the memories of what happened there continue to haunt the town. In the years since Gein's capture, his case has continued to be the subject of books, documentaries, and films, cementing his place in the annals of American true crime history. His story, though horrifying, remains a source of morbid fascination, a window into the darkest recesses of the human mind. Ed Gein spent the remainder of his life in psychiatric institutions, where he reportedly lived out his days in relative peace. Inmates and staff at the hospital described him as polite, quiet, and well-behaved, a far cry from the monster he had been portrayed as in the media. Gein was often seen reading, doing simple chores, and even engaging in arts and crafts, a chilling reminder of the seemingly innocuous exterior that had concealed his horrific crimes for so long. On July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. His death marked the end of one of the most infamous criminal cases in U.S. history. Gein was buried next to his family in Plainfield Cemetery, though his grave became a target for vandals over the years. His gravestone was repeatedly chipped away by souvenir hunters, and in 2000, the entire stone was stolen. It was later recovered in Seattle, Washington, and is now kept in the Waushara County Sheriff's Department, with Gein's grave remaining unmarked. Ed Gein's reign of terror was brief, but the legacy of his crimes continues to reverberate through popular culture and true crime history. His grotesque actions revealed the disturbing reality of human darkness that can exist in the most unassuming of places. Though Gein's body count may not compare to the likes of more prolific serial killers, the sheer horror of what he did, his desecration of corpses, his cannibalistic tendencies, his creation of human trophies, left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. In the decades since his capture, Ed Gein has become a figure of both revulsion and fascination. He is the boogeyman of true crime, the ghoul who lived in an ordinary farmhouse on the plains of Wisconsin, and a reminder that evil can sometimes wear the face of the most unassuming man. His story is a chilling testament to the fragility of the human mind and the horrors that can arise when reality breaks down. The butcher of Plainfield may be long deed, but his story lives on, etched into the annals of true crime, a dark chapter in the endless quest to understand the nature of evil, bottom of form.